Hi and welcome to the channel. I think this was where we left last time. We were talking about everything on its right place, and after such a good response from you guys giving feedback and discussing new ways of improving the patch and everything, I thought it was time to make a video response for that. And in this video I want to show you guys a revision that I made to the original patch that sounds more or less like this. And this revision takes in consideration all of the feedback you gave. So I wanted to share with you this updated patch. So if you want, you can take advantage of all the good discussions from the first video and also have either another patch in your library or a revision of the first one. Thanks a lot, guys, for all the contributions. Big shout out for Ken Flux. I hope I pronounced everything correctly. Bauput, and also Anthony Faulkner for all the good feedback. And as a bonus, our friend Bauput actually sent me his version of the initial patch to show to you and analyze a little bit his take on that. This is so satisfying to see that not only you guys reproduce it in your own synths, but you took a step further. So I'm super glad to see all this interaction and have the opportunity to be part of this community. So the first thing I wanted to talk to you about, it's actually my choice of a filter. As Ken Flux mentioned in the comments, if you remember from our first video, on my research on the original recordings for Everything in Its Right Place, I got the information that a Prophet 5 has a 4-pole filter. But when looking into the Hydrasynth list of low-pass filters, I only found 1 and 8 poles. But this was a misinformation from my side, because in essence, without deep diving too much into the math here, essentially the concept of a pole reflects on how steep the curve of the low-pass filter will be in multiples of 6 dB per octave. So 1 pole equals 6 decibels per octave, 2 poles equals 12 dB, and 4 poles is basically a 24 dB per octave filtering, meaning that a 4-pole filter is in essence a low pass ladder filter 24 dB per octave. We will discuss more about this when I give you the details of the revised patch, but I'm planning to make a new video only on filters to share with you, because I learned a lot on doing this revision now. Another misconception that you guys very well point out was in relation to the voice menu. In the original video I mentioned adding density and detune to create a thicker sound, but those parameters only take effect in the Hydra if we change the polyphony mode to unison. Then the density of voices and detune will have an effect on how your patch will sound. But in our original patch here, since we were using it polyphony in polyphonic, density and detune will not affect our sound. So here it is. After listening to all your good feedback, your tips and tricks, I have worked upon the original patch from the previous video, trying to bring in all your good comments and suggestions. So without further ado, let's deep dive onto this patch. I will start here with a voice menu, and here's where we spot our first changes. The polyphony is still set on polyphonic mode, but as you well highlighted, in this mode the value of density and detune won't have any effect in our sound. Therefore, I have removed density here to 1 and I have removed the detuning. I kept the analog FL to 82 to give this patch analog feeling, and this was something something I have not included in the original patch, but it contributes to simulate the analog synthesizers. And what the random phase on does to your patch is to mimic the behavior of an analog oscillator circuit, which will be oscillating in the background even if you are not triggering any notes by your keyboard. And then when the keyboard gate will actually open up the amplifier, you can start listening to that wave in any moment of its phase. So this gives you a more random organic sound, which is characteristic of the analog synthesizers. I have also changed a lot the stereo mode. I left it here still on rotate, but you can observe that my stereo width here is actually set to 0. And this was one of our biggest discussions on the previous patch comment section on ideas to how to create this stereo spread on the Hydrasynth. I left warm mode on also to give this warm feeling of analog. But if I go to page 3 here, I've been a little bit rebel going against your advices there, and I turn snap on. And what this will do is affect the overall attack time in our envelopes, creating this snappy effect that I was looking for to try to mimic that click from the Prophet 5. Now, if we have a look at our sound sources here, you'll see the strategy I've made to get more control on the stereo spread. So if I go to the mixer here, you'll see now that I have on top of oscillator 1 to its max volume added oscillator 2 here to a volume of 78. And this is part of the strategy to create the stereo spread more in sync with the tempo, but this will be clearer when we look into the modulation. And if I go to page 2 on our mixer, you will see that my oscillator 1 is panned all to the left and oscillator 2 panned to the right. I haven't changed anything on the panning of the noise on page 4. So let's have a look at the sound sources here. My oscillator 1 is essentially the same as the initial patch, which is a saw wave without any detuning, but the biggest change here was on mutant 1. So now you can see that in the phase or diff, I kept the same feedback, but I reduced the depth to 40.4 and I reduced dramatically dry wet to 8%. And the reason for that is because, like you well mentioned, the values I had on the initial patch were basically turning my sawtooth into a square wave. This is very easy to verify if we go to an empty patch here and start with a saw wave. And then we apply the mutant here using those extreme values I had. You can see that when I make the signal wet, we are squaring out the sawtooth. And this was not the meaning of the original patch, of course. We wanted to keep the sound of a saw wave. So by retrieving a little bit this value here, I got still some texture and saturation to my waveform without changing too much its original shape. So if we look at oscillator 2, is in essence a copy of oscillator 1 detuned only -2 cents here. Here it is oscillator 1 and oscillator 2. And the mutant 3, which is the mutant for our oscillator 2 here, is basically the same as mutant 1, no change in values here. The reason why I'm duplicating oscillator 1 values is to create this stereo effect that we discussed so much. Just to complete our sound sources here on our noise, I kept blue noise, but the only change was to its volume here at 41.4. Now, if we look at the filter, this was also part of our discussions from the first patch. And the correct choice here, if we wanted to be simulating the Prophet 5, it would be a ladder filter 24, but that filter is uncompensated. So I actually thought in the aftermath here that if I use low pass filter FAT 24, I get a result closer to the Radiohead recordings. But this is a little bit of my own take on the filter choice here. For this filter, the sweet spot for my cutoff value was 66.1, resonance set to 30. I kept a very similar to the original patch envelope one amount here on 8.8, and the same here for LFO1 in a value of 3.2 with a key track of 100%. But also following some of your tips here, if we go to page 2 on the filter, I actually added a bit of drive, again trying to saturate the sound a little bit more. If we now look into the filter modulation, I can start with envelope 1 here, and you can see that my attack value is set to 0. I heard your good tip here to avoid attack set to 0 because this could create an artifact of a click in the sound. But since I was looking for that click, I kept at least the filter envelope here to 0. My decay value on 8 milliseconds, no sustain for the filter envelope, and a release of 2 milliseconds. You guys pointed out very well that if we use linear values for attack, decay, and release, they sound artificial. So the way to create a more organic sound is to actually go to the page 2 of your envelopes and work upon the attack curve, in my case here with the value of -62 for exponential curve. On the decay curve, I've used the value of -64 logarithmic progression, and I added no change to the release curve. If we now look at the LFO1 that is modulating filter cutoff here, I've used a saw up synced to the BPM, so BPM sync on here at a rate of half a tempo. And on the trigger sync, I've set it to poly mode. But when we look at the amplifier, I have actually added a velocity modulation here of a value of 36. And what this does is to be a little bit more sensitive. So if I play the note slowly, the volume is slightly lower than when I play it harder or faster. And my amp level here is set to 62. If we now look at the envelope that is controlling the amplifier, here you can see the logarithmic and exponential curves of the decay and release time. I have changed the attack to 1 milliseconds, following your advices there. Decay set to 1.2 seconds, sustain at a value of 40, and release on 704 milliseconds. If we now go to page 2, you can see that I haven't changed anything in attack since it was so short, but I've focused more on the decay curve here, exponential value of 40, and the release curve here also exponential with a value of 23. Okay, so far so good. One of your ideas there was here on pre-effects to make use of a compressor. And despite I loved how compressor sounds, I was a little bit insecure to mess up our transients there because I wanted to keep that clicking sound. But I haven't made use of any side chaining. I kept the ratio to 20:1, my threshold here on -32 dB, and I let the compressor attack to be longer than our envelope attack phase, so we don't miss the clicking of the two envelopes. My release here is set to 285 milliseconds, output to 128, and the wet set to 59.2. I haven't made any changes on the reverb from the initial patch, but that's pretty much to your taste. So this is the default Hall values from Hydra. But in post effects, I have tweaked it a lot, our equalization here, to how the new filter was sounding. And I also tried to listen again a little bit more to the Radiohead original recording, setting my equalization to be a little closer to the band's music. So I kept the equalization type to low boost preset here, but I changed the value of low gain to 13.3, high gain to 1.1 dB, and I also increased the mids here to 6.9. I keep the shaver low and high to its original values, and I put the equalizer to 100% wet. Okay, but a big part of our discussions were around that stereo panning, and the way we do that is on the mod matrix menu, And here you can see what I have done. I had a slight different approach than the ones we discussed, although it was based on the same idea of duplicating oscillator 1 into oscillator 2. But here on my mod matrix, I have actually connected my LFO 3 to the panning of oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 to very extreme values. So if we have a look at my LFO 3 here, this one is set to a sine wave at the rate of a half a tempo dot, so the BPM sync here is on, with the trigger set to poly, but I have also changed here the phase of the LFO to 82 degrees, and that's why you see when I come back here to LFO that the wave starts from its peak almost there. And I kept the level to 128 on LFO 3. If we go here to page 2 on LFO 3, I also added smooth to level 45 so that the end of the cycle is not so apparent and it loops a little bit better. And what this is doing, if I hold the chords for you here, you can see how much the oscillators jump from one side to the other. And I think the practical musical effect of this for myself was that I was holding the C note here much more, and I was responding to this half a tempo and releasing my hand. So it's a different effect than if I trigger the notes repeatedly and don't raise my pinky here. Then you barely hear the panning, but if I keep that note in the sustain phase, it emphasizes this stereo effect. I also like to vary and try to activate aftertouch even more on the low notes here. This gives me an extra bite to the end of the curve. But I think the main purpose here was to actually give you more control of the stereo distribution, and that this respects the beat of the song. So if you're playing with a band or trying to sync your stereo spread to a delay in your voice or the singer's voice, you could achieve this with more control. In comparison with the first patch, which I really like the spread as well. But my feeling is that the initial patch tries to emulate the overall mix of that song, including this bouncing effect of Tom York's delay that really creates all that atmosphere. But maybe if you do want to play with a band and will apply and mix this patch with vocals and everything, maybe revision 1 is the option that you are looking for. For a quick recap here, we alter a bunch of parameters on the voice menu to give this patch a lot of the analog feel of the original Radiohead song that was recorded on the Prophet. And one of the biggest differences between the revision 1 to the original patch is that now we duplicate oscillator 1 into oscillator 2 with a slight detune. We fix the mutant here to be closer to a sawtooth wave. We decrease the volume of the noise, which is our third sound source here. Then the sources go through the mixer for panning right and left for our stereo spread strategy. We have then changed the filter choice for a compensated 24 dB filter that is modulated by a very short envelope like the original patch to give us the click sound, and also slightly modulated by LFO1 that is in sync with the music tempo. And then when we talked about the amplifier, we also had had changes on the envelope curves that now we don't do decay and release as a linear descent, but we worked on easing the curves. We have added pre-effects with a compressor. We kept our delay and we added post effects as an equalizer to round off the sound. But the main stereo spread strategy relied on using LFO 3 to modulate the panning of oscillators 1 and 2, and also from the mod matrix we are routing the keyboard aftertouch to the opening of the filter there. For me, it's not a matter of if one sounds better than the other. I think both patches have good qualities that I liked, so I kept both here. But I really felt that this one deserved a video response for you guys, because you had so many good ideas that I wanted to discuss in video format with you. And talking about good ideas, Bowput also sent me his patch, his take on the first video. Let's have a listen. What I really like about your patch is the clicking quality of it. It felt much more percussive than my revision 2, but you have so many other tricks upon your sleeve. Like adding the routing to the modulation wheel here, which opens up the possibility of opening up the filter during the performance. He worked even further by creating very interesting macros that I want to show you. But before that, let's have a look at his strategy on the stereo spread, which is very interesting. If we look here at the mixer section, he kept the two oscillators with the same volume, but on page 2 here also splitted them up quite widely on the stereo spread. And if we now look into the mod matrix, here is another super cool idea, which is to actually use the LFO 3 to modulate the volume of oscillator 1. And if we look here to LFO 3, this one is in sync with the song beat to a rate of 1/4 of a tempo. So this gives you much more control when playing with other instruments or effects so that you can synchronize your clocks. But he didn't stop there. I think a super good quality of your sound design, again going back to the mod matrix here, was all these subtle pitch modulations that you create to reproduce the analog sounds. So he's using LFO 4 to control pitch modulation in both oscillator 1 and 2. Let's have a look at the behavior of LFO 4 here, and that is a very slow LFO that is not synced neither to the BPM nor to the trigger, oscillating in loop, and the differences are so subtle. You can barely hear the pitch modulation here, but what this is creating is this feeling of the analog detuning. If we continue looking to the routings here that he created, here is the mod wheel routing to his macro, which allows you to open the filter. I will show you that macro is super cool, but he's also making use of the voice mode of the firmware 2.0 in the Hydra to modulate the pitch in oscillator 1 and 2. I won't deep dive into the voice mode here, but basically you can give 8 different values that will be triggered every time you play a note again and again. This will create even more complexity in the oscillator's pitch modulation, all to modulate to this analog feel. Now let's have a look at his macro. Super exciting here. I go to the macro assign menu and add it here on the filter macro. So for those of you who doesn't know, a macro is a series of commands that you can do that can be activated by a single modulation control, right? And look here, he's affecting envelope 1 decay, which is our filter envelope here. He's also opening up the filter cutoff. That's why when I use the mod wheel here, you can see how the filter opens up. He's changing the sustain or the volume level for envelope 1 that is controlling the filter. And on the macro page 2 here, he's also adding filter 1 drive and affecting the reverb dry wet levels here. But this I thought was really clever. Since you are opening your filter, you also have all these high frequencies coming in, and the feeling that you get is that your volume is being boosted too much. But to compensate this, he actually reduces the amp level, and this normalizes the sound. Super cool move here, man. I really loved the sound of the open filter on the patch. Super cool ideas, several valuable lessons here. I hope I can make justice with the editing to all the good work and feedback you guys gave. And this serves as an extra patch for everybody that wanted to have one more Radiohead patch into your Hydrasynth banks. As always, thanks a lot for watching and for being such an engaged community. This is super exciting, guys.